We try not to use too much overly technical economic language on this program when we talk about the issues surrounding us now. So I'll try not to get too technical here, but the coronavirus crisis has raised the question in a lot of people's minds. What is it about our system that absolutely sucks at getting people, whether it's the medications they need, vaccines developed and invented, face masks? What is exactly broken with our system that makes it so hard for our system, such as it is, to prepare for a crisis or to respond to a crisis? My next guest has written an article for the New Republic that addresses that very question. Alexander Zaitchik is a freelance journalist. He's been on the program before. He's also author of the book, The Gilded Rage, A Wild Ride Through Trump's America. And he has, as I said, written this recent piece in the New Republic. Headline is No Vaccine in Sight. The U.S. was once at the cutting edge of pandemic prevention. Then Big Pharma took over. So first of all, Alex Zaitchik, thanks for coming back on the program.
Always good to be here. Thanks for having me.
And secondly, okay, so what is... I sort of teased it a little bit, but what is the main thrust of your article?
Well, the main thrust is sort of historical overview of how we got here, which is a drug development and pricing system that is based on intellectual property and specifically monopoly ownership of intellectual property in biomedicines, which incentivizes industry to focus on those molecules that can be sold for the most amount of money. And it's a very narrow focus, and people are aware of the problems inherent in that system. Anyway, I mean, this has been a discussion for a long time, but the current pandemic has really kind of thrown it into crystal clear relief that the vaccine development in this country has slowed to a halt, largely because of this system, which is not geared towards preparing for high risk, low probability events like pandemics. The money is very much in things like fancy cancer therapies and lifestyle drugs, not rare flus that could, take over the world on short notice.
So the current, if you turn, as we have, the production and sale of pharmaceuticals over to the private sector, profit-driven, I mean, there are only two ways that you can make money if you're a pharmaceutical corporation. One is by selling a lot of a certain drug, meaning there's got to be high demand for it. It's something year after year people are going to want. And the other is by charging extremely high prices for it. So maybe it's a less common disease, but still shows up year after year. You charge $100,000 a year per treatment. And even if only a few 100,000 people use it every year, you're still, if you're a big pharma, going to make money off it. But the scenario where you don't make money is if there's a pandemic, you're developing vaccines, there's only a 1 or 2% chance in any given year that there will be a widespread disease, and it might not be the one you develop the vaccine for. So I guess the point is, under that scenario, if everything's turned over to the private sector and to big pharma this way, the drugs just don't get developed, right?
That's pretty much the size of it. Yeah, I mean, there is a nonprofit drug research world. There's government research, academic research, but we have a system now where the actual development, testing, and large-scale production is being left to a private sector with very little interest in those things when it comes to vaccines, where the governments are generally the main buyer. They can drive down prices. People only need 1 or 2 shots. And there's just not a lot of interest. And the governments that used to be able to have a sort of full cycle oversight and, authority over vaccine development, they no longer have this, because we're now in the 5th decade of, call it what you want, but basically the slow motion and accelerating privatization of pharma sectors around the world. And the situation is completely different than it would have been had this happened, say, in 1965 and certainly 1945, when the government was in direct control over how research was undertaken, how it was funded, what drugs were produced, how much drugs cost. I mean, most drug companies were nationalized, or a lot of them were nationalized during the Second World War, and the impact of that sort of government-led medical research drive sort of lingered into the 1960s and 70s, and then it really started to turn into the world that we know today, with this extremely financialized sector that does whatever the hell it wants with no price controls whatsoever, and not even any fear of price controls at this point.
And you have, one of the aspects of this that you mentioned, Alexander Zaitchik, is the patent system. So, most people, I guess, or a lot of people in this country especially, might think, well, that's the way it works. These drug companies invent the drugs and they can do what they want. And if they don't want to invest in vaccines or produce vaccines because they don't see enough profit in it, that's just the way things work. But our patent system is not something that grew on trees. It's not a natural thing. It's a deliberate choice. And maybe you could talk a little bit about how the patent system works against us in a situation like a pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're absolutely right that there's nothing natural about intellectual property laws. They're just creations of societies and governments. And patents have been with us a long time. They're nothing new. They're a way for people to claim invention and profit off them. And they used to be about sharing, the components, the systems, so that they actually contributed to the sort of collaborative science model that is now it serves a very different purpose. Now patents are about building walls around discovery and monopolizing those discoveries for as long as possible. And the length of these patents have been extended when it comes to medicines to 20 years and even more. The industry has gotten very good at tweaking patent law so they can continue to extend monopolies past the standard 20 years so that they can basically just run the house and just print money off of these, monopolies on science that otherwise could revert to, an open pool where generics could be manufactured, et cetera. So it's really a problem for most people with essential medicines. Now, under the current pandemic, you're seeing how it's also a very powerful obstructive force for international research efforts, because you may have a nonprofit lab who doesn't care about the profit motive. It's not driving them, but the research that they're doing keeps bumping up against these walls that have been erected by the patent system and by companies that do very much want to protect their molecules. And you can't really divide, nonprofit versus profit in the world of science, where everything's kind of connected and one discovery leads to another. And there's a sort of natural flow. And it's a lot of the sources in the story that I wrote that you mentioned talk very eloquently, more so than I can, about how this is really getting in our way to address these extremely difficult and pressing, urging threats that we're going to be seeing more and more of in the coming years and decades.
And again, we're speaking with Alexander Zaitchik, who has written an article for the New Republic, No Vaccine in Sight. And one of those sources that you quote, Kendall Hoyt at the Geisel School of Medicine at Dartmouth, says, quote, when researchers have to navigate multiple patents to assemble the knowledge required to develop a vaccine, it slows progress. And to add insult to injury, in a lot of cases, these patents are developed at government expense to begin with, or a lot of the basic knowledge behind the patents. And then private corporations are allowed to patent them for themselves, right?
Yeah, that's one of the most frustrating, maddening ironies of this whole situation is all of these patents are based on, or almost all of them are based on research that has been instigated, overseen, and in many cases developed all the way through, especially at the most high risk, expensive points of development by federal subsidy. Now we're up to $42 billion a year that's dispersed by the National Institutes of Health through a vast network of academic, university, and military labs that employ an awful lot of scientists. And basically what's happening is those breakthroughs are being flipped to industry, who can then claim them and do what they want with them. And that could include nothing. That could include just shelving some important breakthrough and use it for, chum to attract investment, but they don't actually have any interest in doing the research. And there's many cases of this happening with regards to pandemics, including possible pandemics, including Ebola in the story, if readers want to take a closer, more granular look at some of these chapters in recent history. But yes, it is an industry based on public money, and it has been privatized. The medicines, in many cases, privatized beyond public reach, and that includes possibly a vaccine for COVID-19. These companies are extremely resistant to make any sorts of price guarantees or access guarantees, not just around the world, but even in the United States. Even though, in the case of, say, remdesivir, Gilead's possible treatment with activity against severe COVID, it could be produced for as little as $1 a shot, and that came out of research, as did so many of Gilead's drugs, came out of publicly funded research. So everyone should be absolutely furious about this. And, the fact that they're even trying to get away with profiteering off COVID-19 vaccine, especially when that possible vaccine comes out of government-funded research, is just, it's hard to believe the arrogance of this industry. And, it's painful to say, but the reason why they're so strong and so arrogant is because we have set up a system in which they could become the monster that they are. I mean, they would not have been possible had not the patent law in this country been changed and our intellectual property vision been enforced around the world by the U.S. Trade Representative's office.
Yeah, I think it's so important for people to understand that it never had to be this way, and it doesn't have to be this way going forward. And in your article, Alexander Zaitchik, you quote Peter Hotez, testimony vaccine specialist before Congress, where he described how they had promising vaccines for SARS and for MERS, and conceivably those might have been related to vaccines we need now. But then those pandemics receded, drug makers, meaning big pharma, lost interest because they didn't see the money in it. So I guess I would ask you, well, number one, I totally agree people should be furious. And number two, based on your research for this article, what do you think would be some policy steps we might make in order to ensure that we have a better system in the future than we have right now?
Right. Well, Elizabeth Warren has a couple pieces of legislation she's put her name on with Jan Sikowski. One would establish a public drug sector for the production of essential medicines, which would guarantee access. And by breaking patent on a lot of very expensive essential medicines, it would also kind of deflate the private sector and the corresponding political power that they've amassed. That's important. She also has a COVID-19 Manufacturing Act. I forget the name of the bill off the top of my head, but it would basically guarantee access and fund federal manufacturing capability, I believe. I'm sorry if I'm wrong on that. But, there is a medicines access movement that's been growing in the U.S. and around the world since the days of HIV medications, the first effective retrovirals that were being priced, 10,000% more than they cost to make. That kind of sparked this global movement that has really never gone away. And now they're sort of, their argument is resonating with a larger audience than ever before, because it's not just the poor countries, but the rich countries are realizing that the system has failed in some very severe ways. It's a system failure. It's not just a market failure in certain instances, but the whole thing is completely unsuitable to the kinds of threats that we're going to be facing in the 21st century. And we've had 20 years of warnings that something like this was coming, and that the patent model was structurally unsuited to thinking long term and investing correctly to meet these kinds of challenges.
Well, Alexander Zaitchik, I'm going to conclude by making a statement based on something I read in your article that shocked me. You don't have to agree. You could disagree if you want, or I'll give you the last word. But you write, a recent analysis by the Roosevelt Institute showed that the 10 biggest pharmaceutical companies spent nearly 170% of their net income, meaning 70% more than their net income, tapping cash reserves and borrowing on payments to shareholders and executives through stock buybacks and dividends in 2018. I read that, and I think that big pharmaceutical corporations nowadays are wealth transfer engines on behalf of their executives and investors, that occasionally a spin-off of pharmaceuticals as a kind of waste product of their main venture, which is wealth transfer, but that they're not really in the business of providing medications to people who need them. But that's my radical lefty read of that particular item from your article. But I'll give you the last word, and you can disagree with me if you want, or just talk about something else.
I won't disagree with you on that point. I will point people to another idea as a closing thought. There's a law professor at the University of Indiana named Fran Quigley, and he has a forthcoming article that makes a pretty convincing historical and legal case for some of these companies that have been price gouging just to inflate stock price and pay executives many millions of dollars. And he basically says that under the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution, the takings clause, and also precedent related to what's known as noxious use or public nuisance, because these organizations have been acting so antithetical to public interest for so long, that the government, some future government, obviously not this one, would be within its rights to simply take over their facilities and all of their IP, which again originates with a signature by Uncle Sam.
Well, I think it's a fascinating idea, and we'll be looking for that article as well. And people who want to read your article, Alexander Zaitchik, it's in the New Republic. The headline is "No Vaccine in Sight." Thanks for writing it. It's a terrific summary of why we are where we are, Alex, and thanks for coming on the program.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, Richard.